Today is Wednesday, March 18 in the year 2020, just in case we end up putting this film in a time capsule, because you get that bicentennial time capsule out there on the plaza. And when you and I first spoke 2 months ago about doing this class, I don't know that 2 months ago that I don't know if I had even read anything about the coronavirus. Do you recall if you had?
I don't think so. Things look different.
Things look different. To give us a hand with the glance of the eyes, seeing how different they are, this is the front page of the New York Times at the moment. And the goal of this class, as we first strategize it, was to fully address the climate crisis, climate change. How do you feel about addressing that today, given the context for the coronavirus crisis?
Well, in an emergency, you need to triage. You need to deal with what is most essential first. So we clearly need to address the coronavirus pandemic, and I think we're beginning to do that. There's a silver lining in the coronavirus in that we may learn some lessons about acting in an organized way globally to address emergency situations. And some of that learning may help us in the future to get back on track addressing climate change.
Yeah, unless anyone think you're being glib, because it almost could sound as though you're belittling the coronavirus. We'll get back on track after this. And we know, we've been talking all day, that that's not the case.
No, coronavirus is a once in a century pandemic. Coronavirus is as serious an emergency as I remember in my lifetime, and I'm 45. That being said, it pales in comparison to what is coming, the scale of the emergency due to climate change.
Yeah, because I think currently the scientists are, and the data scientists are suggesting worst case scenario in the United States have about 1.7 million deaths, out of 360 million people. British scientists are saying worst case scenario. No, I think they're saying moderate scenario, 500,000 in the UK, which sounds and is horrific. And we're not even mentioning yet how we feel personally about the people that we love and are concerned for. But that is fractional, 1.7 million in this country compared to what we're facing with this climate crisis.
We could lose hundreds of millions of lives due to climate change by 2100. We could lose billions of lives. There's a study that came out that said we may lose up to 90% of the population on this planet, human population on this planet. And it's certainly possible that over the next century or two, humans could cease to exist on this planet. That's a real possibility.
So I can hear a lot of people, a lot of my students listening to this saying, come on. Okay, Boomer.
That's what people said about the pandemic a week ago.
Right. No, I'm only saying that because we're talking about 2100. Even 2050 sounds distant. So if you're 18, 19 years old, I don't know how you feel, Ritu. We have one student in the audience today.
Thank you for being here.
Because she's being paid to be here. We're hearing all these news stories the past 24 hours, 48 hours. It was St. Patrick's Day yesterday, that a lot of people are out, having a good time, because why worry? Because the younger you are, the healthier your immune system, the less vulnerable you are. and might as well, party like it's 1999, to quote a long old song. But the thing is, if you think about if 2050 sounds to you maybe far away, and let's say you're 18, we'll just guess that. So 2050, she'll be 48, right? She'll be 48, basically your age.
Yeah.
And so Josh has 3 children, ages 2, 6, and 9, if I'm correct. And I'm sure you can look back as when you were an undergrad, and that seems kind of like yesterday in a certain way, which is maybe a good segue. We'll come back to, putting into juxtaposition coronavirus and climate crisis. But I always like first my students to have a sense of, who is this person who thinks he has something valuable to tell us. So you can go home, everybody. The one student. What were you like when you were, let's say not 18, but what were you into at the age of 14, 15?
Well, I really wanted to be into girls, but they hadn't yet talked to me. I played soccer as a kid. I played a lot of Nintendo as a kid. I was a good sort of math and science student. I teach physics now, so that's always sort of been my thing.
And where was this happening when you were a teenager? Where were you living?
I was in Grand Rapids, Michigan, so not too far from here. I liked science. I liked building things. Thought about becoming an engineer, but decided against it.
So what led you to become a teacher?
When I was an undergrad at University of Michigan, undecided what my major should be, and I sat down and had a conversation with a friend of mine, and she said, "Don't worry about what your major is. What classes are you interested in?" And they were all the sort of Einstein, relativity, quantum mechanics, and she said, "Okay, you're a physics major." And so I kept taking physics classes, and then had to decide, what do you want to do with that? Do you want to go into industry? Do you want to sit behind a computer all day? And I decided I wanted to be teaching.
So flash forward,
Yep.
you're a physics teacher at Kalamazoo Central High School, one of the two, there's 2 big public high schools in Kalamazoo, Michigan. How long have you been there, and what's the backstory to, because anybody who does even a quick Google search on you knows that you've been identified as this really important teacher in terms of motivating your students to get involved with climate issues. So how did this all happen?
So I've been teaching at Kalamazoo Central for 12 or 13 years. But it was only last year, at the very end of the school year, that I heard an interview with David Wallace Wells on NPR.
David Wallace Wells was a journalist, written some books, right?
And he wrote a book called The Uninhabitable Earth. So I would have thought that as a physics teacher, as a science person, as a well-informed person who reads, the New York Times and everything, I had a good understanding of climate change and the urgency. But it wasn't until that interview that I was listening to that it really dawned on me that we were in an existential emergency that needed to be addressed now. It went from an intellectual understanding to a visceral understanding in my body that this is a crisis. Holy shit, we got to do something about this now.
Sorry to interrupt. Could you narrate for me, because I've heard you mention it, the specific story of how this relates to, because as we heard from you a few moments ago, one can look forward, and the science tells us that we're facing a horrific scenario, something out of the worst possible dystopian science fiction story. And some people really are motivated by fear, but my feeling is what underpins that fear is love. It's love for oneself, it's love for the person you're closest to, or the children you're closest to. And I know that that's a big part of your story. Can you relate that for us?
Well, it's everything that you love in on the earth and in your life. For me, my greatest love, my wife and children. And there are nights where you're lying in bed with your kids. So that evolved, and over that summer, I met lots of different people, just started learning and absorbing the local expertise. I met Denise Keel, who is a professor here and heads the climate change group here on Western Michigan's campus.
Let's just take them.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So I want to give the students who are going to be watching this, I'm going to edit in at this point the Greta Thunberg video.
Sure.
Do you want to introduce it a little further before we run that? Just keep filming.
Sure. Well, this was a TED Talk that Greta gave early on in this movement, and she talks about...
It's 1918, I think. I mean, it's 2018. Not that early.
You're not that old. But she talks about how the fact that this is an emergency, and people weren't acting like it was an emergency, and she is on the autism spectrum, and so that didn't make sense to her. If it's an emergency, why aren't we acting? Why aren't we hearing about it every day? Why isn't it on the news every day? And it's interesting now to go back and revisit that in the midst of this coronavirus pandemic, which is being responded to largely as the emergency that it is. This is what she was calling for,
Right.
except for climate change. Again, that silver lining of the coronavirus.
All right, great. So we'll go to the film with Greta Thunberg, and we'll come back here in a few minutes.